concepts of what we talk about as the JAMstack and how React fits into that. So before that, just a little bit about myself. I'm Matt Biilmann. I'm the CEO of Netlify. Netlify is a platform that manages all the workflows and automation around working with modern front-end projects. It came out of a background where I spent a while in Spain, 7 years, working as CTO for a company that built websites for small to medium businesses, but at a really large scale. So we would build like 100 websites a week, tens of thousands of sites in total, with a network of freelance designers that would do the actual design work, and then in-house project management team, support team, sales team, and a large tech team that built the whole platform that the designers would do the design with, and that all the clients would use for content management of their sites. After building that, I started a company called Webpop, based on taking the idea of that kind of platform and then making a fully cloud-hosted content management system that other agencies and professionals could use to get some of the same efficiencies into their workflow when working with this new stack. But something happened while I was working on Webpop. Like, I came to the Bay Area, I worked on the product, and then I started to see front-end development just fundamentally change. When I launched Webpop, the #1 feature request without any comparison was FTP access. And today it's like, who used FTP 5 years ago here? Quite a few. Who uses FTP today in their day-to-day work? Not a single one. Well, no, there was one that actually used it, right? But it's just been a massive change where suddenly Git became the way developers not just do version control, but the way developers collaborate and publish and have their whole workflow. Microservices became like a huge phenomenon that we've heard the word quite a few times today, right? Like this idea of monolithic application being split into smaller parts. Modern JavaScript has exploded, and probably most of you today are using like ES6, which again, like just 5 years ago, we were struggling with Internet Explorer and figuring out how to even make anything run in JavaScript, right? React.js has obviously come into the scene and has exploded in popularity. So while I was working on Webpop, I started seeing all of these trends happening, and I started to see like a paradigm shift happening in how we're building the web and how the architecture for the web looks. So for the last 15 years, the web was basically built with an architecture where you had a large monolithic application talking to a database for every website. And when a user visited, it would run that and send back some HTML generated on the fly, and maybe we would decorate that with a little jQuery, but that was basically like how we built websites. That led to huge security problems. Like, anybody that's ever run a WordPress blog probably knows what it takes to just keep it from running once you put it out there. Performance has suffered a lot, and it's become such a problem that we're starting to see platforms like Google AMP or Facebook instance pages or even mobile apps as an alternative to the web, simply because there's this feeling that the web is not performant enough and that the experience can't get good enough. And scalability became a larger and larger problem of the legacy web as just the number of web users grew, right? Like, if a post goes viral today versus 10 years ago, the amount of traffic that will send to a single web property has completely exploded. So that means that we've moved towards like a change in architecture, where if we go really back to like the old days of Unix and so on, we started out having like an internet model where you would have a client that connected to a server, and the server would, like, the client would be a rich client, just sending messages back and forth to the server and communicating in that way. Then we built out this whole legacy stack, the three-tiered architecture and the LAMP stack and so on, where we had a client that would be a browser that would talk to a web server, that would talk to an application server, which would talk to a database, it would send back data, the application server would stuff that into HTML templates and then send back dynamically generated HTML. then we sort of had the start of the rise of single-page applications, where we started to really decouple the front end and the back end and say, okay, we're actually to some degree going back to the client-server model, where we have a React application or an Angular application or an Ember application that talks to an API running on a server. But what's gone even further is that we've now sort of changed from a client-server model to a client-services model, where we have a front end that lives directly on a content delivery network. It loads in a very short time, and then it talks to different microservices. So that's sort of a new stack where we've decoupled the architecture, and where we've seen the rise of all the build tools. How many here use Webpack from time to time? Quite a lot. The whole idea of having like a build tool that spits out a ready-made front end has just completely been normalized in the last 5 years or so. We can take that front end, we can put it directly on a content delivery network, we can distribute it on servers all over the world instead of having like our one traditional web server in a data center. And then from the browser, we can talk to all these different services. That obviously gives us like a ton of advantages. Sites just load way faster when we can load them from a CDN than when we have to go on a run trip to a server that has to build them on the fly. We sort of put this, we decouple the build stage of a site from the part of a site that's actually running, that's actually being served, and that stops so many of the typical security vulnerabilities that we know from all the dynamic frameworks out there. And it also gives us a completely different sense of scalability, because once your front end is just on a CDN, you can scale that to a very large degree. And if you build right with this architecture, a lot of your microservices will only be involved when people do a request and not when they load your application or your site. And that makes it way easier to actually scale. So we call this a lot of people have started to talk about this as the JAMstack architecture for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. Basically saying that the architecture we work with, like the stack itself, has moved up a level, where before we used to talk about the stack as for example, the LAMP stack, where it was really like Linux, Apache, PHP, MySQL, right? It was all about like a specific programming language, the web server we used, the database we used. And now suddenly, we have this whole new category of developers that mainly works on code that runs in the browser, where JavaScript has become the universal runtime of everything we do. We talk to APIs or microservices, whether it's like serverless Lambda functions or traditional REST APIs. And then we have some markup that the browser will actually get from a CDN, and that will kickstart the whole process, whether it's like markup from a statically generated content site, or whether it's like the index HTML and the core of a single page application. So for React specifically, this stack ends up looking something like this. In the old architecture, we had, if we had something like a WordPress site or a Rails site, we had all these plugins that would live inside our big monolithic applications, right? So in WordPress, you had a WordPress plugin ecosystem. In Rails, you had Ruby gems. And they were inside your big monolith. Now we're starting to see, as browsers become so powerful that we can talk to all kinds of services from the browser, a plugin ecosystem emerge outside of any of the monolithic frameworks. So suddenly you can have your React application, and you can talk to Stripe, or you can talk to Lambda functions, or you can have Algolia running your search without actually having any code yourself. And we start seeing this layer of plugins move from inside big monolithic applications to just being microservices that we talk to directly. Now, one of the things that we saw when we started building Netlify was, on the one hand, the promise of this, but on the other hand, the reality of how do you actually then work with this architecture? How do we build workflows around it that makes it just as easy to spin up a site built like this as it would be back in the day to create a new WordPress site with a one-click setup somewhere? And we start seeing all these patterns emerge where instead of just completely randomly talking to all of these services, we start building flows around it, where we have our client, we have our CDN that serves the front end, and then through that CDN layer, that API gateway layer, we talk to all of these different services, provide authentication, and so on. And now I'm going to do something really stupid, probably. So here in the weekend, Ben pinged me and said, like, don't rely on internet at the conference. There won't really be internet. So of course I went ahead and planned to do a live demo of all of this and of deploying to a global CDN during my presentation. So this will probably go horribly wrong. How many here knows Create React App? Almost everybody, right? It's become like the default boilerplate. This is a little variation of Create React App that we've put out from Netlify. It has a little deploy to Netlify button, and I'll explain what it does. But it's basically just a clone of the Create React App repository with a few extra things added. I'm going to click through here. Netlify will ask me to connect to GitHub, and I'll connect to GitHub. Let's call it, and start building. So what I'm doing now is telling Netlify, like, I have this GitHub repository that I would like to start a new project from. Netlify has identified that the repository is a React repository, that it uses Webpack to build the process, and has started spinning up a build machine where we're now running the Webpack-based build for this framework. And basically what we've done is that we've said that once we have this clear architecture where there's always a build tool involved, there's always a CDN involved, we can be completely unopinionated on what tools do you use. Do you use React? Do you use Ember? Are you building a Gatsby site or a Hugo site? But very opinionated around the architecture, and then we can automate the whole workflow. So what's happening here while I'm talking is that now we have the site that's live, and in these few seconds, while I click through here, Netlify has done the work that typically you would have like a fairly large DevOps team working on for months. So we've set up a new Create React App site that's loaded from a globally distributed content delivery network with servers all over the world across 7 different cloud providers. We've hooked up a continuous deployment infrastructure, which means that every time we push to Git, Netlify will run a new build and deploy it. And as we'll see, we'll even do that from pull requests and so on. And as a bonus, and this is something we actually just launched this morning, which is our AWS Lambda integration. As a bonus, like I obviously ran the Webpack build and spit out a front end on the CDN, but in my build, there was also a little folder called Lambda that had a little hello world function, and we'll look at it. And Netlify also deployed that function to AWS Lambda and set up a little route you'll see here. We're calling a relative URL on the site .netlify/function/hello. And it's actually triggering this little hello world Lambda when I do that. So we have that code living together with our site. Let's have a brief look at how that actually looks like. So this is the new repository I have in my GitHub account that normally I would Git clone locally, and I would have a local development environment. But here I'm just going to go directly through GitHub's web interface. And if we look at this is all the standard Create React App plus a little Lambda folder. And in here we have this little hello.js file. It's a tiny little AWS Lambda function with a handler, with an event context and a callback. And it just says hello world. And just by including this file, Netlify knows that, okay, we have a Lambda function, we deploy to AWS Lambda, and we set up the routing around it. What's more, let's go in and change this a little. Create a new branch. And I'll create a pull request. And now, just by creating this pull request, you'll see that Netlify picked up a new pull request and starts building. So I'm going here, and now we run a new build. All the dependencies has been cached from the first build, and we're now building this new version of the Lambda. Boom, site is live. I go in, and we can check out the deploy preview. I have a URL here called deploy preview, and then the rest of my site. And if I click my little lambda, I'll see hello Reactathon. But on my main site, I still have the old lambda running. So this actually built a complete staging environment for me for this pull request without any other work than just clicking this button. If I merge this in, the new master will go live, and we'll have a new lambda in production, all with relative routing and so on. This used to take a lot of time for DevOps team to build. A second, let me just see what this one is doing. Okay, here we go. Just to talk loud, now I showed like a really basic example of just this architecture for a simple React application with one little lambda that said hello world. This is an example that we have a case study about and that we'll be writing a lot more about. That's interesting for a lot of front-end developers because it's a publication for front-end developers called Smashing Magazine that recently migrated from this kind of architecture and to the new kind of architecture. So Smashing Magazine is like a publication that's been running for more than 10 years now. They used to have their main publication be a WordPress site with, again, 10 years of history and 200,000 comments. They had a shop in Shopify where they sold printed books, ebooks, and so on. They had a job board that was a Ruby on Rails app, and they had a conference site that was made in Kirby. And they had to maintain the same theme for each of these 4 platforms and try to make it look the same. And then they wanted to do a redesign and introduce a concept of memberships. And they had this problem that with this old kind of architecture, they just had 4 big monolithic applications, and 2 of them, a couple of them, they controlled the code of themselves, and one of them was a managed service. And they had no way of making them aware of each other apart from just trying to skin them so they looked the same. So they moved from this kind of setup and then to an architecture that looks more like this. So in their case, they made a build with a Webpack and a static site generator called Hugo. All their content now lives in a Git repository, so there's no longer some weird binary database of content, and all of their content is under version control. Every time they push to GitHub, Netlify will run their build with Hugo and Webpack, and it will spit out a front end that's served directly from a CDN. That front end includes all the pages, also the listings and paginations and everything. But then it uses Preact. How many here knows about Preact? Quite a few. So Preact is interesting. It's API compatible with React. So when you work with it, it's just like working with React, but it's a very small file size. So it's in this case the basic setup for them with their normal front end decorated with things like e-commerce and comments and so on, was around the same size of just a jQuery download. Super efficient, right? And for these kind of hybrid setups, that makes a lot of sense, where you have a big content-driven site, and then you have different components. Now, a lot of these components talks to different microservices. So when you go to Smashing Magazine today and you go to their membership section and you sign up, it talks to an open source service called GoTrue that we also run a managed version of at Netlify. When you register for a membership, it will send a request. It will send a request first to Stripe with the normal Stripe widget, and then it will use one of these small Lambda functions to just send the request there, have the Lambda function make the actual subscription with Stripe, add you to a mailing list, add the subscription information to the little identity service, and then return a response. When you buy a book, the Preact component will talk to a small microservice for e-commerce that will just like create an order and send it off and persist the order. All of this meant that they could go for this old architecture with 4 different major monolithic platforms and themes and 4 different even template languages like Liquid and PHP and so on, to having a single repository where all their content lives, and writing basically their whole functionality in the front end as a combination of just static HTML and CSS and then Preact components. And then they have like a total of 3 small Lambda functions that glues together the different services they talk to. There's less than 600 lines of custom backend code in that whole project, powering all of that. The CMS they're using is an open source project we started called Netlify CMS, which is a React application that just sits on top of GitHub. Again, all of their content just lives as text files in GitHub, as markdown with front matter or YAML files and so on. And Netlify CMS is essentially just a React-based UI that sits on top of GitHub and lets normal content editors edit in a normal CMS UI. But every action they do gets translated into a Git action. So when they create a new article, that creates a new pull request with a new markdown file. When they create a new book, that creates a pull request with a new YAML file. And when they click publish, that merges the pull request into the master branch. The whole build process kicks off, and Netlify publishes the result. So you really start just merging these flows. That's really the concept of this JAMstack, where in many ways we go from having an old role of like front-end developers working in a certain way on the surface and then handing over most of their front-end to a back-end team that stuffs it into some monolithic application and runs the deployment cycle there, and to making front-end developers the main developers that works on a higher level of the stack, writing JavaScript, talking to APIs and microservices, even writing Lambda functions, delivering everything from pre-built markup, with advantages in performance, scalability, reliability, and developer experience. So that was all from me. Happy to talk much more about this. Ping me at any time.